Tony, for your kind words. Talk about CSR 3.0, but we're also going to talk about what's been happening in the last decades in terms of how CSR has evolved. So in one sense, we're going to take a trip down memory lane. At least from our perspective, you're going to find out that there are many ways of defining CSR, and you're going to hopefully get a lot out of this content. Okay, so we're moving from corporate social responsibility to the C standing for citizenship, S standing for sustainability, R standing for responsiveness. If you're talking about Europe, they don't use the word CSR. CSR is a very American term. The Europeans like to use the word sustainability, and that's what they come in for. As Tony mentioned, we are looking at these three items. Next, please. And this is kind of the original definition of CSR. I noticed already that even then, they were already talking about CSR being more than just doing good for business. They're talking about economic development, the quality of life. In fact, this is the notion that pervades CSR today. For example, when Yolanda hit the EDC, the Energy Development Corporation, their mandate was first look after the welfare of the employees, find out that their families are safe, and then go to the communities that they work in. So it's their employees, their families, and the community, and then society. I don't know if you can read this. It says culture, passion, brand, reputation. Next. What we're looking at, what we're looking at in my center in the IM, we look at the intersection, the interface between the company and the environment, broadly defined, meaning both the business environment, the economic environment, as well as the environment environment. Next, please. Okay. If you look at it, philanthropy, just charity, giving away money, predates CSR. We have the Bayanihan, we've got religious charity. We've done a study of 8 countries in Asia, and all of them have a sense of spirituality, whether you're Muslim or Catholic or Buddhist. So philanthropy is very important, and it's still alive and well. Next. There are also corporate foundations. And a lot of corporations set up foundations, but they also have CSR internal to their department. Next. So what happens, next. So what happens if you get in-house CSR offices and programs, which include external donors, and then they give funds to corporate foundations. There's also an organization here you're probably familiar with called the Philippine Business for Social Progress. It used to be able to collect money from corporations. It does a lot of donor funding, but it acts as an important intermediary between corporations and communities. Next. And of course, you have corporate social responsibility. Okay? It looks at, the problem with CSR is that your priority is still your shareholder. And the shareholder is the guy who put in money in the company. Because of CSR, shareholders tend to have a longer payback period. In other words, they'll say, because it's a CSR program, we're willing to accept getting our money back in 20 years and not in 1 year. Now, the foundation is important, the corporate foundation. It's important because it moves from shareholders to stakeholders. It more actively involves communities. And the projects, this is an important thing. SLTO, that's the social license to operate. For example, in the mining industry, it's not enough. If you get all the clearances from the banks and from the DNR, you have to get the community to accept what you're doing. For example, we wrote a case on the mining company in Altamina. It's actually in Chile. The community objected to the mining company because of environmental degradation. NGOs and the communities are pretty smart now. So when they objected, they didn't pick at the company mine, which is right in the middle of nowhere. They went to the main road where the trucks were going down, and that's where they put up the picket, and they invited the press to attend it. So NGOs and the community can be very powerful in making their voice heard. There's a famous phrase, giving voice to value. That's what people tend to do. Next. Okay, I like to use this example because Bill and Melinda Gates have got the biggest foundation site. billion or something. The endowment 10% is pretty good. So at the same time, Bill and Melinda Gates are known as representing Microsoft, so you can't separate the two. The Gates Foundation does a lot of things on malaria, poverty alleviation, etc. The Microsoft Foundation, Microsoft itself, it's got an interesting CSR program. For example, one of the things that they did some time ago was they provided computers which they gave to prevent child trafficking. The border from Nepal to India, so there's a lot of child trafficking, prostitution, slavery going on. So that was their CSR. They provided computers, obviously for a reason, which is directly related to their CSR. So you can see that you can combine CSR with philanthropy, and that helps in giving you a good perspective in terms of being able to do something. Next. Okay, I have to talk a little bit about, I have to advertise my institute a little bit. This is the Ramon T. de Rosario Center. I need to emphasize citizenship because that incorporates a broader societal concern, something Tony had already mentioned. It focuses on sustainability, which talks about the environment and the future. And responsiveness, which means it requires immediate action, to be proactive rather than to wait for something to happen. And interestingly enough, that happened, next. That happened because of Yolanda Hayam. We became involved in it, in research. Remember, we're a research institute. So we were looking at the 5 R's. Relief, reconstruction, rehabilitation, risk, recovery, which leads to resiliency. And we were saying that's part of what CSR should be, that's what corporations should look at. And again, the classic example there was that when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, Walmart was more efficient in delivering goods and services than the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Authority. So corporations can do a lot in terms of providing for responsiveness. And we've written many cases of that. The smart loads, so that people can bring in money through the cell phone, etc. So we're looking at the R as being active responsiveness. Next. Just about the center, I won't even go through that. All I wanted to say is that every year we run a conference. 2 years ago it was in the Philippines, to discuss the effects of Yolanda and other disasters. This year it was in Bangkok, and you'll see what we talked about later on. Next. Okay. You don't have to, you can read this, and you can always download the PowerPoint. But basically we're looking at socially responsible enterprises, and we're focusing on research and capacity building. That's also why I'm greatly involved with Tony, because Tony has a strong multiplier effect by conveying conferences like this and putting people together. Next. Okay, just a quick one, back to responsiveness. It may have changed a little bit, but generally the Philippines has the dubious distinction of being in the top 5 in terms of disasters. And we did some work for about 4 months in Albay. Albay is a great place. Everything bad happens there. Drought, floods, volcanoes, everything you can think of, earthquakes, everything you can think of happens in that area. And Joyce also said today graduate, so we've been working with it. You can see another thing in reality, you can see the things that happen, exposure, vulnerabilities, community, lack of coping capacity and lack of adaptive capacity. That's where we're doing some work on. Corporations generally are a little bit late when something bad happens, but they can help in those last 2 items. Anyway, this is part of what we call responsiveness and multi-stakeholder engagement. We have an interesting story there. And this is where they did a mapping of Albay to find out what areas are most prone to particular disasters. And that helps a lot. And that's where science helps a lot in being responsive. But this isn't about Albay or disasters, so let's go on next. Okay, now we've gone through the overview, and we've gone quickly through what my institute does. This is the main core, which is the evolution of CSR. Long time ago, 50 years ago, or Friedman said the business of business is business. Now, I should update that. The world seems to be run by global corporations. So that CSR is becoming very important in terms of how global corporations can have an impact on CSR. AIM is doing some work with a company called Intel, and they recently finished, some years ago, they finished a project. They were going to teach computer literacy to 1 million teachers who would in turn teach students. So 1 million teachers is a lot of teachers, but then there are 1 billion people in India. So it's still a drop in the bucket. But that's the kind of thing that corporations do when they're good. There are also bad corporations. Next. Okay, now we're moving from shareholder to stakeholder. So companies must address the concern of employees, customers, the host government, the community, as well as environmental issues. Next. In a developing country, the government usually cannot single-handedly address social issues. So corporations become proxies of the government. If you're a mining company, you're involved in building roads. Whether you're a good mining company or a bad mining company, you're involved in building roads, providing electricity, etc. Historically, for example, a lot of sugar mills, towns were built around the sugar mills because the mills provided electricity, and the additional electricity from converting the bagasse into electricity was used to feed the power needs of towns. Next. This one is interesting. So when you look at the Philippines, we're saying that here there are 5 decades. In the 60s, it was kind of philanthropy, donations. Companies just gave money away. Next. Then they started doing networks. So PBSP, for example, tried to get intermediaries and foundations together. Next. That was the beginning of multi-stakeholder engagement. Because initially it was just the company with talking to a particular community or a particular NGO and say, this is what we'll do. Then it became a multiple network, which involved schools, local government, medical facilities, etc. Next. Then we got the partnerships, where you move from organizations to networks to partnerships, where the partners themselves are involved in making strategy. We have this, I did some work in India, and we had this interesting story. It's a big company. It's called Birla. It's a big company. They went to a rural community, and India, northeastern India, where the Naxalite rebels are. So anyway, they said, we come here to build a school. Can we give you some monoblock chairs? Can we get lights? And they said, yes, that's a good idea. But you know what we want? We want a wall. Okay, why do they want a wall? And the answer there was, you see, this India in the northeast, it's colder. And what happens is our students practice agriculture, and they plant a lot of tomatoes and crops. And if we don't have a wall, the goats will come and eat them. And since we are Hindus, we can't kill the goats. Secondly, we also want a wall because it's winter time. When winter time comes, the bears come in and they sleep inside the classroom. So in other words, that's why you have to find out what your community wants. Yeah, another community here said they had no electricity, so they said we're going to have lights. We're going to have lights from the mill to your community. Because we spend our money building a temple. Because we've been used to walking and falling in the dark all our lives, but we really want a temple. So you have to listen to what your constituencies want. And sometimes what you think they want is not really what they want. And that's what this whole thing of partnership is. Finally, 2000s, that's the integration. That's the whole thing of getting CSR into the DNA of an organization. And that's the start of what we call citizenship. Having said that, next. Okay, now we're talking about personal social responsibility. And after 15 years of research, we have discovered, surprise, surprise, that ethics and social responsibility start in high school and college. By the time you join a corporation, your values are already set. The corporation just gives you programs. We'll build a million schoolhouses, we'll plant a million trees, We'll set up medical, rural health clinics. We'll have community livelihood programs. Those are all programs, but you've already got the individual personal social responsibility, and that's why my students are all graduate students. So at this point in time, their ethics has already been set, and that's why I applaud what Tony is doing, moving down to the grassroots, to the high schools and colleges, because that's where you build ethics and integrity. I'm not talking about religion. I'm just talking about social responsibility. And then what's going to happen, so 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, what's going to happen in 2010? That's the last section. That's the one Tony hasn't heard about yet. Okay, next. So some issues. Again, this has to do with, if you're in a developing country, the top issues for a large population developing country are generally education, health, and poverty. And now you've got disaster relief. And different countries have different CSR initiatives. So for example, in Thailand, which has had its share of disasters, they're more developed than the Philippines. So their concern is, for example, things like HIV/AIDS, which involves a lot of stigma and lost productivity, taking care of the marginal upper hill migrant tribesmen, because they already have high incomes. If you're talking something like Korea, their concern is creating green cities. They have no rural area. So every country has got its own unique CSR concern. For a country like Philippines and Indonesia, it usually has to do with education, health, and poverty alleviation. And of course, disasters, which happens for everybody. Next. Okay, just to repeat, the key concept here is what we call the social license to operate, SLTO. Again, we're saying that's very important, social license to operate. It's not enough to have an economic and environmental permit. It's not enough for the banks to lend the money to the communities. Have to be able to agree with what they're doing. Next. So a long time ago, this guy Henry Ford said, "Coming together is the beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success." And that's still a good saying. And that's really what multi-stakeholder engagement is all about. Next. Okay, I'm not going to go through this. You might have seen some variation of it, right? This is the triple bottom line. You've got business in the middle with all kinds of things. And then you've got concerns. Economic concerns, people concerns, environmental concerns. That's just an example of some of the things that happen. This is share of market, supply chain management. IPR here is intellectual property rights. IPR here is indigenous people's rights. So same initials, different meaning. You can look at that when you get the PowerPoint slide. Next. Okay, this is another version. Instead of the triple bottom, another interpretation of the triple bottom line, which is the 3 Ps: people, planet, and profits. And next. So people, for example, is social value, job creation. Remember, Tony was talking about somebody is going to tell you how to get jobs. Knowledge diffusion, improve social systems, etc. Planet. Next. Okay, here's the interesting thing. Talking about resource efficiency, integrated systems, but this thing of closed loop collaboration, that's another variation. People are thinking about not only about the, well, I guess they run out of, they're talking not just about the green environment, they're talking about the blue environment. What does it mean? It means something that's a closed loop system. We'll take a case of that. It means that when you do something, you're environmentally conscious, nothing is wasted. If you run a, for example, if you run a pig farm, you will use the remains so that you can create a electric generating machine. Next. And profit is kind of standard. But the emphasis, as you can see, is in innovation, and we'll look at that towards the end again. Okay, next, we're about a third of the way through. CSR responses next. Let's keep it on. Next. Next. Okay, stop. Okay, so basically what you're saying is it goes up. You start off first with giving, philanthropy. Then you get involved in communities. Then you start creating industry-wide practices. And then finally, you have a business strategy. This is what we're pushing at AIM, trying to find market solutions to public needs and problems. So for example, we've written cases on water in Metro Manila. When it was privatized, clean water became easily accessible. It actually became cheaper in one sense because before the privatization, there were a lot of small entrepreneurs who were gathering water illegally and selling it to poor communities for a price. And then finally, you want to be able to integrate your programs responsibly. Next. Okay, next. This is just, okay. Basically what they're saying is globally, business, government, local community, they're all kind of getting together in terms of common issues. Two, there's technological convergence. Ideas are exchanged, relationships are formed. If you're in the mining industry, you're not afraid of the local NGO, but you're afraid of Greenpeace. That's a very aggressive private global organization which tries to protect the environment. They're the guys who chain themselves to trees, who try to hunt down the Japanese whalers and track them, etc., etc. So that's what's happening, technology, agenda, and finally there's this what global instinct, global, act local. And this happens because you remember a previous slide, the global corporations are everywhere. They don't control the planet, but they're pretty powerful. At the same time, in terms of CSR, they have their mandated required CSR globally, and then they try to adapt it locally. Next. Okay, so this one is this is an entire lecture by itself. We teach that in AN. How you match your external environment, so you do a stakeholder map, you establish your footprint, what's your carbon emission, etc. And then you look at your resources, your strengths, what technology do you have, and you try to align the two. So if you're a bank, you're probably not much good planting trees. But you might be good about teaching communities how to manage their cash flow, especially women. In many rural communities, it's the women who manage their cash. And then the whole idea there is to create shared value. This is what Tony mentioned earlier on shared value. I think our MC also mentioned that from CSR to CSV, creating shared value. So you can see we're moving across CSR from the basics to the evolution. Next. So there are some strategies, from strategy to sustainability, from alignment to embedding. This is the standard mantra of CSR, maybe 2.5, not quite 3. In other words, what you want is to embed the organization in shared values, commitment to multi-stakeholder engagement, and you want them to become responsive and proactive. So you can see CSR is moving from 1 to 3 to something else. And you'll see a little bit when we get to the last slide what kind of evolution we're talking about. Next. Okay. Next. Okay. So again, this is somewhat similar to what you saw when you talk about integrating responsibly. Here you're talking about first you comply, then you minimize harm, then you actually create value for the stakeholders, and then you share this value. You'll see this in a later slide also. Next. Go on, next. Okay, and this is just a summary. You've got philanthropy, you've got compliance. The only thing we've added is what's becoming important is called the value chain, the supply chain. So for example, Jollibee Corporation, if you've seen their television ads, they fund subcontractors to do organic farming for items like tomatoes, onions, etc. Then you've got targeted programs. We'll see some examples of that later on. And then you've got the fully embedded CSR. We actually, at AIM, we give awards for companies that supposedly best practice CSR. Next. Okay, this is the conclusion of section 3. And this is now looking at it globally. As you can see, there's a broad engagement and setting boundaries. Understanding what we call societal signals. The social license to operate is a societal signal. Next. So the cycle is turning understanding into opportunity, Next. Integrate opportunity into strategy. Next. And define business success in the long-term context. Again, you can take a look at this by just getting the PowerPoint. It's available. Next. Okay, this is a quick one. We have a manual. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. We have a manual that explains CSR for corporations. You can say towards strategic CSR. It provides frameworks. It's about 80 to 100 pages. It's available for free, by the way. Next. And I won't go through this too much, but it's a whole bunch of frameworks. Remember, I represent an academic institution. So you've got next. So assessment, value chain assessment, stakeholder analysis, you've seen that. Next. So you move from assessment to formulation, you identify the level of commitment, you develop a strategy. Next. You have to implement it. What is the plan? How do you engage with the community? How do you partner with them? And of course, next, you have to do your evaluation, monitoring. And I think Tony was telling me that he'd like to get the president of FU involved in trying to develop economic and other metrics on the impact of CSR and how do you give value to what is happening in a CSR program. Next. Okay. That's another slide. Again, this thing is like a 15-minute explanation. All we want to say is that you're looking at what the business can do, okay. What are the strategies, what kind of resources you have, and the whole idea, which is again what Paul just mentioned, we have to determine both social value and shareholder value. Social value obviously is a more difficult one, although those of you who are economists will know that there's something called social cost-benefit analysis. Next. Oh, now we get into some examples. Okay, this is the part that I like. So we were looking at several examples. You can read it very quickly. These are what some Philippine company and a Vietnamese company. So for example, this one, the Vietnamese company, is involved in a whole range of activities. And the Philippine company is heavily involved in this. Health, there's one. Health and environment, livelihood. So that's what they do. Next. So by the way, this is a company. Remember I told you what a closed loop system is. That everything that you do has to be integrated. This is a Thai company called AA. So what they do is they get the raw material, they process it, the waste is reprocessed into electricity. They try to develop, they have a pond where they generate all their waste. They have local community protection. So for example, one thing that they do two interesting things. Next. So that provides assets, the technology. Next. And it creates a complete chain. They do a couple of interesting things. One is, they're a paper company. So let's say they sell to somebody, I don't know, so many reams of paper. They will say, the paper that I sell to FEU, for example, the paper that FEU buys is equivalent to 50 trees. So we want you to plant 50 trees in exchange for getting the paper at a discount. That's one of the things that they do to try to become a completely closed loop system. The other thing that they do is they look for marginal land and they pay the farmers to use it to plant trees. So that's how they're trying to be completely integrated in their operation. Of course, they make money. They are, after all, a private enterprise. Next. I'll tell you something else about AA. They look at, next. So they look at the stakeholder concern, the business concern, and the initiative that they can do. Again, this is a very corporate thing. You know? What are the concerns? Okay. What are the initiatives that can be done? And this is the one that's called paper seedlings are planted in unused farmland. Next. I went to Indonesia this year. There's an industrial estate called PT Chababeka. It's the biggest, one of the biggest industrial estates, 6,000 hectares. There's all kinds of things. And we were looking at the things that they're doing. If you're an industrial estate, you've got many companies there, some big, some small. And so we look at what they're doing. What are their CSI initiatives? Economic, growth livestock, duck hatching, etc. Social, clean water distribution. Culture, they have special festivals that they fund. Environmental, tree planting. Education, they've got schools. They've got a partnership with the university. And then health, they've got clean water distribution, somewhat similar to the social, and they provide healthcare services. They train midwives, for example. Next. Okay, I also did some work in Thailand, in Cambodia, Angkor Wat. If you haven't been to Cambodia, you should go to Cambodia. Don't bother going to Phnom Penh, go to Angkor Wat. By the way, I don't know if you can see this. I can't see it. Tonle Sap is the Great Lake. It's the riverway that feeds in Cambodia. This, by the way, is a giant catfish. It's as big as a Volkswagen. It's a huge catfish. It's a danger. But anyway, so we were working in Cambodia, and one thing we're looking at is the cluster, the tourism cluster in Cambodia, in Angkor Wat. If you've been to Angkor Wat, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's a huge building complex, 1 million inhabitants, when the city of London was only 100,000. Collapsed in the 12th century. Next. Oops. Next. Okay, so those are the CSR initiatives that we were involved in: restoration, preservation, protecting nature, animal welfare, training, hotel and restaurant, landscaping, etc., education, and so forth. Next. And this is what we did. If you look at Tonle Sap is a big river. There's an aquifer. There are exotic species. There's a water route for tourists, for example. Angkor Wat itself has got the ruins, but it's also got handicrafts, museums, art history. Next. So we won't go through all of it. But what you can see is there's a lot of initiatives that you can do around a tourism cluster. On lodgings, cuisine, nature, services. So these are the kinds of things where we are helping them. Next. And then in the outer circle, there's the entire additional activity, for example, MICE, which is meetings, incentives, conferences, and exhibitions. Those are the kinds of things that happen when you work in a cluster. And as you can see, the tourism cluster is a good way to develop a lot of CSR activities. So for example, just a quick one. One thing that they do is they train guides to learn certain languages. They become tourist guides, both in Angkor Wat and in this adventure, riding on the elephant, that kind of. Next. Okay, this one obviously is the Philippine coffee cluster. A little bit smaller, but you can see how integrated it is and how you have to deal with multiple stakeholders, not just the company, the farmers, the millers, then of course the distribution system. And you have to be responsive to needs of each community, each segment. For example, customers may be concerned about quality. Farmers may be concerned about price. Next. Oh, this is just one quick note as a side issue. One of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to build an ethical supply chain. That again is another series of PowerPoint slides. We're only going to look at one. But basically, this is a movement that's been going on for a long time. First, it was greening the supply chain, making sure that there was minimal waste. So, for example, from farm to market, there's a lot of post-harvest waste. You want to reduce that. Then there's also an ethical supply chain, which is involving the customers and suppliers. Next. And one model that we have on responsiveness. This is from a mining company. I won't go through it in too much detail. This is actually, we're doing some work with Rapu and with Sagittarius. They have, for example, they set up corporate sustainability teams. Next. Whose core function is socioeconomic sustainability, cultural community. Next. And then they have resettlement. Remember, when a mine plays out, usually you provide incomes for the communities there. Income generating projects, IGP. Next. And then you have to move. This is the next slide. One of the advocacies that we have is you move from conflict to collaboration. And there is a program that's being run by a colleague of mine in a center, not the RVR Center, another center. Okay, next. Next. Okay, this is called Bridging Leadership. It's the Milan Center. But anyway, Bridging Leadership, the theme of that is a society without divides. So the idea there is there's no single leader. Rather, you have several leaders to get together. So my colleague who does work on this does work in, well, quite a bit of work in the south. So for example, you'll get an imam, a PNP commander, and a local mayor who's Christian, and then you try to find out how can we resolve economic and social problems. So the idea is to find a bridging leader, and you work from the leader looks at the divide, engages, and eventually moves into what we call co-creation. Again, that's a whole process. That's a 3-day seminar that we run at AIM. But this is the model that we're using. And it's important because corporations are used to having one CEO, one person who gives the order. What we're saying is that in CSR, that doesn't work out that way. It's not just one person giving the order. It's multiple stakeholders, each of them with an agenda, and therefore you need what they call a leader who bridges societal divides. Next. Okay, conclusion was a challenge. You have issues, you have skills, and you create value. Next, I have a digression here. Next. Okay, identify the correct match and priorities. Next. Okay. This is a recent study that we've been doing. Obviously, as you know, as AIM, we spend a lot of time with big corporations. But we needed to ask ourselves, how important is CSR with respect to firm size? This is something new in terms of the research. But obviously, you know that MNC is a multinational corporation. They have large budgets. The headquarters mandates their CSR. They also enforce penalties. Microenterprise is the opposite. They're basically barely struggling, very few employees, small amount of capital. But what's important is the people in between. Next. Not the micro, not the huge, but the SME. SMEs outnumber multinational companies, especially in terms of both. Also in terms of employment. So they're small, 50 up to 50. They actually spend on what we call IP, which is usually product innovation. A lot of the small and medium-scale enterprises think Cebu exporters. They're doing a lot of product innovation. They also need capital to fund their projects. Okay, next. This is just a quote from Standard Chartered Bank. As it says, small firms can account for a large percentage of GDP. They're important in global supply chains. It's not just big firms dealing with big firms. And many of the smaller firms are internationalizing, going into export markets. So you can find Philippine mangoes anywhere in the world. That's not a multinational enterprise, it doesn't. So, as it says here, SME shaping the future. And this is Standard Chartered Bank, a report they did just this year. Next. I think this is it. Next. Next. You've seen this, and we're reversing it, right? If you're a small enterprise, the best you can do is comply, minimize harm. As you get bigger, you can start looking at what we would call CSR, stakeholder value, and shared value. So for example, if you're a small enterprise, one of the things that you have to be concerned about is paying your laborers a decent or a minimum wage. One of the big problems in the Philippines, for example, is this thing they call contractualization. How many of you are familiar with the term? Basically what it means is that, anybody here from the Department of Labor? What it means is that if I keep an employee for more than 6 months, I have to pay full benefits. So what does a company do? They hire them for 5 months and 29 days. So you're permanently a part-time worker. You never get the benefits. So let's say you have 10 franchisees, you move the same team, one place after the other. So the idea there is you have to minimize harm. You have to be able to have some impact in terms of the rights of your employees and the community. Next. Okay. As you get bigger, you have to do more things. If you're a small company, And this is what you have to do. And this is what I mentioned about contractualization, sorry. Now, if you're a medium-sized firm, you got to do all of this, and then you've got to do what you call customer service quality. You've got to be concerned with quality for your customers. Remember the thing about the kamote poisoning? Or the candy that got poisoned? That's a case where you have to look at customer service quality. Then your community multi-stakeholder engagement. If you're an even bigger firm, you do all of these things plus all of this. So the bigger you are, the more responsible you must be. I guess that's what you're saying. Having said that, we have come to the conclusion that smaller firms, small and medium-sized firms, have a higher impact on CSR and national development than large firms. Next. We have an example of us. You probably know this guy. Namoyan, the toothpaste. He hires the hearing impaired, and he has been able to compete against multinationals, and there's a very strong sense of integrating with their own spirituality, making the difference for the glory of God. But they're basically involved in making life comfortable and giving them employment. So that's an example of a small company doing something. Next. This is a company. Chivasol is a small resort, not a very big one. There are several like that in Boracay, for example. But basically, they have their own integrated hotel operations, resort operations. But what is interesting is they have this quadruple bottom line: economic viability, environmental preservation, social-cultural development, and stakeholder wellness. So they've made their own variation of what CSR means. And of course, in the environment, they're involved in mangrove reforestation. They collaborate with academicians to create a mangrove ecosystem preservation and scientific case. So that it brings the public to understand why you should preserve and protect mangroves. Next. Okay, here we go. This is the end. That's good because we have time for questions. What next? Sorry, you can't read this. Never mind. Whoops. Just look at this. Okay, so 2010, we ended. Now it's 2011, 2012. What did we do? Each year, AIM runs a conference. Sorry, this one was in Bangkok, Manila, Bali, and we've gone to Vietnam, Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, etc. So, what happens? 2011, we were looking at Porter's shared value. 2012, we were looking at business and society. 2013, we were looking at inclusive growth. 2014, we were looking at resiliency. Remember, Yolanda? 2015, we were looking at social entrepreneurship. So the point I'm trying to make is that CSR is right now in a dynamic evolution. We don't know what CSR 4.0 is going to look like. But right now, it's moved, well, this just tells you some of the themes. But it's moved just in the last 5 years, our own research has moved in 5 different directions. And we're trying to figure out what is the decade of the 2011 to 2020 going to look like. And part of it is what Tony is talking about, personal responsibility, bringing it back full circle from corporations back to the individual. Because if you don't have an ethical, responsible individual in college and in high school, by the time he gets to the corporate world, his values have been set. So when we talk about what's next, the answer to the question is we don't know for sure. It's all next. What we did look at, the latest one we look at, is the whole idea of social entrepreneurship. So we're trying to see whether CSR can become tied up to social entrepreneurship. As you can see, this thing just finished about 2 weeks ago. And we brought in a lot of social entrepreneurs. This isn't the time to talk about it, but it's interesting to see a lot of young people with interesting ideas. You know, if you've got a new idea in your developing country, practically anything is a social innovation. Next. Okay. Okay. Next. By the way, back, sorry, go back. It's not too clear because of the shading and the color, so I think you're better off looking at it when you get the PowerPoint slide. You can download it or you can ask it. But basically what they're saying, Intel obviously is a tech company, okay, and they're looking at social innovation, that's their thing. And they're starting with what is your advantage, how can you promote it, how can you develop it. And the more important thing is next. And they have their own version of CSR 1, 2, and 3. So everybody's got their own version of CSR. This one is Intel's, which says, we look at being a good citizen to being a catalyst for social change. We look at risk mitigation, all the way from developing business value. And so it says it moves from CSR 1, which you can't read very well, which is both, let's say, transparency, shared value, and social innovation. So you can see Intel is going in that direction, social innovation. So they're saying the next stage of CSR is corporate social innovation. I think that'll be the end. Next. Yes. So just a quick example before I end. We're also looking at that seriously. Maybe CSR 4.0 is social innovation. And in the program, for example, there were high-tech and low-tech things. One high-tech thing, for example, is there was a young engineer who developed an application which translates the sounds of people who can't talk into speech. Right? What it is, all the guy can do is grunt, and then it gets translated to good morning. That's the kind of high-tech innovation that's taking place. What's an interesting low-tech innovation? There's a kid who goes to school, and he wasn't sure what will happen to the fish in his aquarium, because how does he feed them when he's in school from 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock? So he developed an app on his iPhone. You press an app and it brings out the feed let's say every 3 hours. The app sends a signal to bring down the food. There are other interesting innovations. Some of it are very common. Like, for example, in Africa, people spend a lot of time carrying water on their backs. So what a company did was they designed this big plastic bags, so the housewives just roll it up and down the hill. So there's a lot to be said about CSR and social innovation. I don't know whether that's going to be what is going to happen, but it's something that we're working on. And maybe that's what's next, and that's what the direction is going to look like. Okay.